Tonight our guest is, well, if I had to use one word to describe him, I'd probably use the word innovator, but I've never been known for a person with very few words. So I'd call him an innovator, a pioneer, a filmmaker, an entrepreneur, and just a wonderful guy. He holds 13 patents in the field of special photographic effects and an Academy Award for his work in the field. Ever since he started working on 2001, about 30 years ago, as one of the 4 special photographic effects supervisors, he has been on the cutting edge of the technology in filmmaking. He's gone on from 2001 to make work on such films as Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Blade Runner, An Andromeda Strain, Star Trek the Motion Picture, and Brainstorm, which he also directed. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce a wonderful man that worked on this film you're about to see, Douglass Trumbull. How long do you want me to go? About half an hour? Yeah. Can you do that? You need to stay about an inch from the mic. Okay.
Thank you. I just finished making a bunch of notes on what I would say tonight, and there's no way I can jam this into a half an hour, but I will try to take you through my thought process of what I sort of wanted to tell you tonight. And we're also, Howard, we're going to have a little Q&A before the movie?
Sure.
Okay, because I'd like to, answer any questions you may have before we start the film as well. Anyway, congratulations on this film festival. This is great. It's great to have this happening here in Massachusetts, and I'm here because I support this kind of activity, and I really want to continue to do anything I can to help build a film community in this part of the world. I worked on 2001 for 2.5 years between about 1965 and 1968. I'm going to talk for a while and do a little Q&A. How many of you actually ever saw 2001 in its original 70mm Cinerama release? Oh, that's pretty good. How many of you have only seen 2001 on TV? Oh, see, that's about 50-50. And so I'm going to assume that most of you have seen the movie one way or the other, but I'm going to talk about the differences between watching it on a big screen and seeing it on TV. And certainly a lot has been written about this movie over the years. It's quite a controversial and unusual and amazing movie. I'm not going to comment on the movie or the intent or the content of the story so much, because there's tons of stuff to read about Hal and Star Child and different dimensions and everything. But I will try to tell you something that'll make watching the movie tonight a little more fun. And I'm going to try to break this into 7 categories, which we'll try to jam into a short period of time. And one of them is going to be, why is 2001 different from other movies? The whole business of Cinerama and 70mm that was happening at that time, and what I call my personal holy grail experience as a young man working on 2001. And I thought, well, I've just seen God, and I love making movies on these giant screens, and then the giant screens went away, and I've been hunting for that ever since. Talk a little about film as a first-person experience, which is one of the most unusual aspects of 2001. Talk a little bit about the technology and the limitations that we were faced with when we made the film. I'm going to give you a few clues to what to look for tonight, which might make watching the movie interesting. Tell you a little bit about what I'm doing presently and how I'm trying to refine this, what I call the holy grail of the cinema, and talk a little bit about IMAX and the future of the cinema and what's going on. So the first idea is, why is 2001 different from other films? And certainly most of it is due to Stanley Kubrick, who I admire as one of the most gifted and brilliant and intellectual film directors of our time, and one of the greatest filmmakers ever to hit the planet. And he had a completely wild and unconventional idea for this movie, which was to make a giant screen 70mm Cinerama experience for the audience that would in fact be a trip for the audience, an adventure into space, told in a completely new and different style, in a completely new and different way. And it was obviously totally different from Dr. Strangelove or Lolita or any of the other films that he had made before that time. And in fact, totally different from any movies ever made since. And one of the aspects of the film was that the sense of immersion, the sense of being on a trip and being immersed and actually going into space as a direct experience for the audience was directly related to being able to project this movie on giant 90-foot wide Cinerama screens. And I don't know exactly how big this screen here is, but I'd say it's probably not more than about 25 feet. And so when you were in a Cinerama theater, it was as though the screen would wrap out beyond the sides of the walls of this theater, and you'd be sort of more engulfed in the movie. And that was a very important aspect of 2001 and its effect on the audience. 2001 also went into some new territory in really trying to experiment and develop new special effects techniques. None of us knew what we were doing when we started making this movie, including Stanley Kubrick. So we were making it up as we went along. We were developing new techniques and experimenting with cameras and lenses and photographic ways to solve some of the challenges of the script, while the script was changing every day too. But again, the movie, via special effects, was able to deliver an experience that was beyond normal reality. This wasn't, taking place in a cafe or a train or a boat or in the desert. It was like someplace you'd never been before. And that's one of the things that has had a very profound effect on me as a filmmaker, because I like being able to bring something to an audience that they will never experience in normal everyday life. And in fact, 2001 even went beyond that, and it sort of went into another dimension. Not just another place, but virtually another place in time and space, which was the whole Stargate sequence at the end of the film, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And in fact, I sort of think that the film is like almost a religious and spiritual experience. It's like an epiphany or some kind of conversion experience, because it's almost completely nonverbal. It doesn't matter what any of these guys say to each other on the screen. There is no suspense, no plot per se, no drama, none of the classic cinematic conventions that you'll see in almost all other films. This movie just happens before your eyes. And in fact, a lot of what is said is completely banal, boring, and in fact turned off audience when it first came out. People didn't know what Kubrick was trying to do. But it also has the unique quality of being like music, in that you can see this movie over and over and sort of enjoy it again, because it's a big sort of visual symphony. It doesn't resort to a plot, and it doesn't resort to story conventions that, where you know how it's going to end up. It really doesn't matter how it's going to end up. It's more of an experiential thing that you could look at any number of times and enjoy it again, and maybe even enjoy it more. Cinerama on 70 millimeter, for those of you who don't know what Cinerama was, it was originally a very wide curved screen with 3 35 millimeter projectors running simultaneously to create a kind of an almost seamless panoramic image that was very, very wide. It was 3.5 times as wide as it was high and wrapped in a very deep curve. And 2001 was one of a very few pictures that was made just after Cinerama converted from what we call the 3-strip process, or three projector process, to a single camera, single projector, 70 millimeter widescreen process. And at the time 2001 came out, I think there was something like 55 Cinerama theaters all around the world in most of the major countries. And you'd find one of them in many major cities. And these movies usually were shown on what we call a hard ticket basis. And you'd almost have to reserve your seats in advance. You would reserve a specific seat in a specific row in a specific section, just like you'd buy a ticket for a live theater or a musical concert. And the tickets were usually 50% over the going rate. And the experience of seeing a Cinerama movie was considered to be some kind of an event, something you do on a holiday or a birthday or a celebration of some kind or a corporate party. It was thought of by the public as an experience sort of outside the realm of normal cinema. Unfortunately, right about when 2001 was released, there was only one more 70 millimeter film made subsequent to that, and that was Ryan's Daughter. It was the last feature-length 70 millimeter film ever made until just a couple of fairly recent experiments. But this sort of tragic thing happened where the business of exhibiting movies found out that they could achieve more filled seats in theaters by dividing them up into duplexes and quadruplexes and having 100-seat theaters, 200-seat theaters, 400-seat theaters, and just moving the film to whatever theater there was enough audience to fill up. And it statistically, it increased movie attendance, but it dramatically wiped out the giant screen cinema. And all those Cinerama houses were chopped up into little multiplexes. And that was the tragedy for me, because I was completely hooked. And I thought, well, I love this 70 millimeter special effects thing. I'd like to do some more. And I found out subsequently that it was almost impossible to do that and make movies like 2001 again. So the palette or the tools of having a giant screen at your disposal just went away, and movies standardized at 35 millimeter, usually not even widescreen and often not even with stereo sound. And so the many, many years have elapsed since that time, and now movies are really very story-driven, very casting-driven, very gimmick-driven, and we don't see movies coming back to the theaters that are really vast and spectacular experiences that even get anywhere close to what 2001 was doing at that time. And movies are also kind of disposable these days. You see a movie and it's going to last for 2 or 3 weeks and then move on, and then you can rent the tape, but these movies all go away. They don't become classics. And one of the big things for me as a filmmaker is the thing that you can do when the screen is big and it's deep and the film is extremely high quality is this, what I call a first-person experience, where you as an audience member, in a way, replace these characters who are on the screen and actually become one of these characters on the screen. And this is a very important thing that happens in 2001, and you'll see it later in the film. On most films, they're loving each other, they're killing each other, they're chasing each other, they're whatever to each other. You're sitting there, you're not one of them, you're just watching them do their thing. And you sort of get into it through a sort of action and empathy and a lot of cinematic standard tricks to get you hooked in and immersed in the movie. But there's not a sense of participation. So it's that sense of sort of being there and being in the movie that has been an ongoing drive for me. And in 2001, I think one of the things I'm most proud of working on was what we call the Stargate sequence, which was quite a revolutionary first-person experience, to where we didn't know this was going to happen when we were making this movie. When we were shooting that sequence, which you'll remember, Keir Dullea gets in the pod and he's going to try to figure out what's going on at Jupiter, and he sort of gets sucked into this fourth-dimensional experience. In earlier versions of the script, Keir Dullea was also there in another pod and going ahead of, Gary Locke was ahead in another pod, and they're sort of chasing each other in pods. And we started shooting shots that were standard cinematic conventions of three-quarter shots looking over the shoulder of the pod into the Stargate, or from the Stargate looking at the pod coming forward, and normal editorial coverage of an action sequence. And Kubrick intuitively recognized that was interfering with the audience's ability to become Keir Dullea and to have this experience for themselves. And so all those shots were abandoned. We never even finished them. And you get into this sequence where you are respected as the purpose of the movie is for you to go on this trip. And so I believe this sequence actually, from the beginning of the Jupiter sequence and up to the end of when Keir arrives in the sort of synthetic hotel room, is almost 17 minutes of uninterrupted point of view photography with no dialogue, no drama, no suspense, no action, just pure visual experiences. And this whole thing sort of ties into another phenomena, which is also little used in the cinema, which is sort of like some form of meditation, or like a mandala, or like some kind of a chant, or some kind of rhythmic or hypnotic experience. And you'll see that it has that kind of quality. And that was actually what saved 2001, because in the first month of release, 2001 got very bad reviews. Nobody could figure out what the hell this movie was. The theaters were nearly empty, and MGM was about to pull the plug on the movie and just, move on to the next movie. And they were about to pull 2001 out of all the theaters, until a couple of the theater managers said, well, maybe we ought to wait a couple of days, because there's these like hippies with pot in the front row, and there's more of them every day. And it was actually the drug culture of the 60s that revived 2001 as a trip experience, as a psychedelic experience. So, of course, this whole thing completely warped my career. Not that I was on drugs, but that I was completely hooked on this kind of cinema. And I found out later you couldn't do it on the small screen, so I've been off doing all kinds of weird stuff, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there is today, I think more than ever, a tremendous public thirst for what I would call virtual reality. I mean, the idea of virtual reality is that you can put some headset on your eyes, you know, sort of like watching an old 3D movie, and trip out, go into some alternate space, go into another dimension, have an experience beyond reality. And this is a tremendous, tremendous public interest. And I was very amazed that I recently was asked a few years ago, I guess it was in the late 80s, to do the Back to the Future ride for Universal Studios. Has anybody here seen the Back to the Future ride? Okay, thanks. This is, I came up with the idea of a simulation experience back in about 1975 and built a simulator ride at that time, but it was an idea way ahead of its time. But the Back to the Future ride is, in fact, a movie projected into a giant hemispherical screen, like a planetarium. And instead of sitting in a seat, you're seated in a flying DeLorean car, like the car from the movie. And this car is mounted on hydraulic rams, like a flight simulator. And the movement of the rams is coordinated with the movement on the screen and the sound and the music. And it was the first time I felt I'd ever really fully achieved this sort of holy grail goal of actually, as an audience member, penetrating through the screen. It was not only getting rid of this classic proscenium arch, I had left my seat and moved and gone right in and become part of the movie. And so even though it wasn't what you'd call cinema, and it wasn't 2001, and it wasn't 2 hours long, it proved to me that we could in fact make it work in today's market, that there is in fact a huge public appetite for experiential cinema, and it sort of urged me on to keep plugging away at this weird alternative form of entertainment. On 2001, the technology we had at the time was very limited. We were using what's publicly known as 70 millimeter film. It's actually 65 millimeter film. Doesn't make any difference to the size of the image. It's just that they added 5 millimeters to the width for the magnetic soundtracks on the prints. But we were shooting in a 65 millimeter negative. And everything you'll see in this film, in the special effects sequence, is like if you see a scene with the Earth in the background, and stars beyond that, and some spacecraft in the foreground or something like that. That's at least 3 different photographic elements that all have to be photographed separately. The stars are photographed on one piece of equipment. The Earth is photographed on another piece of equipment. The spacecraft is photographed on a stage with miniatures and tracks and lights. And all these motions have to be coordinated, and then they have to be optically combined together into a single piece of film. And at the time this movie was made, there were no optical printers to do that, which is the normal traditional technique of combining several films by printing them together in a some kind of a optical sandwiching technique of multiple exposures. So virtually everything you'll see in this film was shot as separate elements, and then these separate elements had to be actually printed in the camera. We would take a negative in the camera with the what's called a yellow, cyan, magenta separation of the original element. Each element had to be an original color film of the stars, for instance, or an original color film of a planet, had to be broken into 3 black and white films of yellow, cyan, and magenta primary colors. Those were sandwiched with a new negative, and then a bright white piece of cardboard or something was held in front of the camera. Light would come through the camera and print that film onto a new negative. And so there'd be 3 exposures for the stars, and then you'd take all those films out, throw another bunch of films in. It would be the 3 exposures for the Earth. Take those all out, throw the films in for the 3 exposures for the spacecraft. And so that now you'd have 9 pieces of film to make 1. And because we didn't have what's called mats, which was ways of being able to superimpose one thing in front of another without having some kind of a ragged edge that would be very obtrusive, we just very delicately moved things out of the way. So you will see that in any effect shot in this movie, as soon, you know, if you're seeing the sun or the Earth or stars or whatever, and then some big spacecraft or space station will start looming into the shot, well, you'll see the Earth sort of starting to get out of the way, because we couldn't We couldn't make it fit together. Secondly, we didn't have any what's called motion control, which was developed after 2001. We didn't have computers. We only had motors off of drill presses and lathes and things like that. And so all the cameras and motions were motorized so that we could make these smooth, continuous motions, but you also see everything that moves in one direction at a constant speed. It never speeds up, it never slows down, it never changes direction. So you'll see some scenes where the stars are moving up, the Earth is moving up, but the spacecraft is moving left to right. But those are all constant one-directional movements. And this entire film is restricted to those kinds of one-directional movements. So you'll see that throughout the film. All of the stars and Earths and many of the shots were done using animation techniques. We had a 70mm animation stand where we could put transparencies. We just use Ektachrome transparencies of large paintings of the Earth, for instance, with a piece of black cardboard and some celluloid, and we'd run it through the animation stand and expose it with the camera looking at it. And all the stars were just white paint spattered on shiny black paper, painted by myself over and over. The suns are all just a hole in a piece of black paper with a very bright light behind it, way overexposed, about 10 stops overexposed, with lenses very carefully selected to give certain kinds of lens flare effects. And all the miniatures were shot on a stage, whether it's a space station or the Discovery spacecraft or a pod or whatever, shot on a stage with more of a live action crew, but the camera is moving very slowly, one frame at a time, because the lens has to be stopped down to a very, very tiny aperture in order to get depth of field, which is that everything remains in focus. Miniatures look very phony if you don't have a lot of depth of field. So if you have to stop the lens down, you have very little light, and if you have very little light, you have to have a long exposure. So it would take sometimes 10 seconds to 30 seconds per frame to make each frame of the film. And so guys would be standing around all day long watching this camera go, goop, goop. You know, it would just be, took forever. And I'm really making this very simple because it's actually substantially more complicated than that. So what to look for tonight? Watch all these objects getting out of the way of each other. It's sort of fun. The lighting, which was all very, very cleverly and ingeniously designed as a sort of a collaboration between Kubrick and Jeffrey Unsworth, who was the cinematographer, and Tony Masters, who was the production designer. You'll see that a lot of sets actually light themselves up. The lights are actually built into the set itself. And it's one of the most unusual aspects of this film. Kubrick designed these sets so that once you could just turn the set on and almost aim the camera anywhere you wanted to, and the shot would look great. There was no hidden lights behind the camera or over the actors' heads or behind a flat or a set, because many of the sets were completely enclosed, particularly the centrifuge. The centrifuge, you know, where they're racing around like squirrels in a cage, was a giant rotating set about 40 feet in diameter on hydraulic motors, and all the lights were mounted on the set, and they'd stick the camera and the actors in the set and turn it on and start rotating it. And I'm oversimplifying that, but it was very complicated, and we found out that movie studio lights don't like to be turned upside down, and when you do, they blow up. And so there were lots of hellish problems, but you'll see that this is one of the most beautiful things to watch for in 2001 is all these sets that light themselves up. There are many rotating set effects which are very ingeniously constructed to where the actors can look like they're walking upside down, which is really a set that's built on a rotating gimbal, and the camera is mounted to the set, and the lights are mounted to the set, and then the actor can walk in the set while the camera and the set rotates upside down. And that was true for the centrifuge and some of the docking hubs and couplings and things. And it was an ingenious effect that was very effective. Everything that looked like it was weightless was in fact a stunt performer in a spacesuit hanging from the ceiling of the set, and the camera on the floor looking straight at the ceiling. So by having the camera looking straight up and the actor dangling straight down, the actor seemed to be right in front of his own wires, and it created a kind of a floaty, weightless effect. And it was very effective, but very dangerous. And there was this crazy, he was a European soldier of fortune who hung his hat out as a stuntman. And he had been through so many hairy things over the years in Europe, blowing up bridges and getting involved in all kinds of wars, that hanging from wires on a stage just didn't faze him at all. And he had to have a little oxygen pack, and there was a little bleed of oxygen into the helmet. But that really wasn't enough. It really wasn't like a real respirator. It really wasn't like a scuba outfit or anything. And he just said, listen, turn on the oxygen, hang me upside down, and when I go limp, let me down again. Because he would just go unconscious, and he didn't care. So that's one of the funny little things. The slit scan effect, which is sort of the core of the Stargate sequence, was sort of a big epiphany for me, and it was really an idea that I came up with based on another man's idea that was come before me in the film business, named John Whitney, who was an experimental sort of abstract filmmaker. And the epiphany was that a piece of film is nothing but a sensitive surface onto which you can put light. And how the light gets on there and when the light gets on there is completely controllable. And what I realized was that instead of just opening a shutter briefly for a moment and capturing a picture of this whole room, for instance, you could have a very thin opening, which is called a focal plane shutter, moving very slowly across the front of the film, so that the film only sees a little sliver of this room at one time, and a little sliver of this room at another time, and a little sliver of this room at another time. And it accumulates an exposure over time. And what I realized is when you thought about film in that way of accumulating an exposure over time, that while that time is elapsing, you could move things all around. I could have a room full of people with flashlights all moving around, and I would accumulate these weird exposures. Or I could have a room where it's November 1st on this side of the room, and it's November 15th on this side of the room. If I waited 15 days while the shutter went across. And so it was a revolution to me that you could think of film as a way of accumulating light. And I built this crazy machine which had a slit, so that the slit was not in the camera. The slit was out in front of the camera, and behind that was light. And I could move artwork in front of the slit, and I could move the camera in and out relative to the slit, and I could leave the shutter open for a minute at a time while I very carefully moved patterns of high contrast sort of op art with colored gels and create this streak effect of an accumulated exposure that took a minute per frame to shoot. It was an agonizing process, but it was how we created this kind of completely abstract space-time corridor for the Stargate sequence. I'm out of time, so I'm going to go over time. Thank you. Right now, I'm working with a company called IMAX, which makes giant screen projection systems and large format 70 millimeter film systems with theaters all over the world. And this format has been around for 25 years, and I've been watching it emerge. And it has nothing to do with the cinema as a commercial business. IMAX has almost always been sort of natural history films and travelogues shown in science museums, like the Mugar Planetarium in Boston is probably one of the closest ones, and there's a IMAX theater at the Natural History Museum in New York and things like that. And so we have about 130 theaters around the world. But I'm part of a transformation of this company into starting to make commercial films and build theaters in commercial multiplex centers. And this is turning out to be finally, after almost 30 years, able to get back to this giant screen immersive cinema. And it's very, very exciting. And what we're doing now is going to be, I think, revolutionary for the cinema. The 35 millimeter movie business doesn't know what's coming up on its tail. And so we're experimenting with all kinds of new cinematic forms and new ways to tell stories and new ways to involve the audience in what's happening on the screen in a much more powerful and immersive way than normal cinema can do. A writer is in this room, if she's still here, that I'm working with on a film that is, I think, going to be completely revolutionary and breaking all the rules of what the cinema is all about. And we hope that this film is not only going to be a powerful first-person experience and a powerful emotional experience, but something that is so unusual and so unique that it is absolutely unreplicable. You will never be able to show this movie on TV because it will make no sense whatsoever. You wouldn't even be able to show this movie on this screen because it would make no sense whatsoever. It has to be a screen like this, and the images come out of the screen to you, and what happens on the screen happens directly to each member of the audience personally. So that's sort of what I'm working on now. I think it's a whole new paradigm for the cinema, and I hope it makes some kind of contribution to the future. Another big thing that's going on right now, which we're working on at IMAX and many other companies are working on, is that we're in the midst of a digital revolution. That we're at a point in history where we're getting closer and closer to the transformation from chemical-based film to digital electronic cinema. And you're seeing all these amazing movies, you know, like Independence Day and other movies coming out where more and more of the film is being made digitally. Digital matte paintings, digital sets. We're even seeing digital characters that you don't even know about. Crowd scenes with digitally created crowds. We're in a huge transformation that's going to be a very important part of the cinema. And one of the most exciting things about it is that you can do it yourself. You can do it on your home PC. You can make a movie digitally that's going to be very close to theatrical release quality for very little money with a very small crew anywhere in the world. And I think it's one of the things that's going to really empower filmmakers and make it possible for us in remoter areas of not being in the middle of Hollywood or New York to actually make world-class entertainment. So I think that's about it. I hope you enjoy the film. I'd like to entertain any questions you might have for a couple of minutes, and then we'll run the movie. Yes, right there.
Besides the changes that have happened visually, there's been a lot of changes since 2001 in sound. And the soundtrack from 2001 was so seminal. I wonder if you could address some of the changes that are happening in sound and how you incorporate that in your work now.
Well, one of the big changes that has happened in the cinema, even though the image itself has changed very little, there has been a transformation towards digital soundtracks, finally. You know, finally you've got sound in the theater that's almost as good as you have in your car or on your Walkman. And that's pretty important. It's still a kind of a hybrid technology. It's very interesting. Most of the digital sound you're hearing in theaters is actually CDs that are playing in sync with the film. It's not sound that's actually on the film. Because film itself, 35 millimeter strips with sprocketed plastic, is a totally obsolete sort of Singer sewing machine, Maytag washer kind of technology that hasn't developed since the 20s. So yeah, sound is evolving, and now it's time for the pictures to start catching up. And clearly the audience appreciates good sound and appreciates better quality images. So there is a trend now not only toward more digital sound, but to larger screens and more steeply raked seating. So if you go around to some of the new multiplex cinemas around the country, 12 plexes, 15 plexes, some of those theaters are big 65, 70-foot screens with steeply raked seats, great sound systems, and we're getting back to a better experience. And in terms of production, you just can't beat the fact that you can record dialogue, music, and effects digitally, mix them digitally, and get them to the theater without any loss or degradation or hiss or any of the stuff we went through on earlier films. Yes?
I'm wondering what we can do to support this new technology, like going to the Omni Theater in Boston, or where can we make our interest in
I think one of the main things you can do to help support these kind of new medias is to really sort of register your vote with your pocketbook is by showing up at these theaters. And I'm not trying to sell tickets to IMAX theater because it doesn't really make much difference to me, but you do have to tell if you have to go to a local multiplex cinema that's really pretty junky and the floors are sticky and the pictures are out of focus and the projectionist really isn't paying attention, you really should complain. And I think those are unacceptable practices that really drag this industry down, and it's been too bad for a long time. So basically, you vote with your pocketbook where you spend your money, and a lot of people are listening. Yes, back in the back.
For the film that you said you're working on now?
Oh, I'm not going to give you a name of this film because we're still tricking around with the title, but when you see a IMAX 3D film, hopefully sometime next year, about aliens and being abducted, and you sort of find out, well, the audience is going to get abducted, that's the movie. Yes.
You speak of your epiphany in 2001. Is the Stargate sequence your favorite?
Well, I wouldn't say the Stargate sequence is my favorite per se of things that I've worked on, but it was a very pleasurable experience, and it was what really launched me, because I was this 23-year-old kid. I'd never worked on a movie before. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I also didn't come with any baggage. I didn't know what you shouldn't do. And Stanley Kubrick was not saying, don't do that. And one day I had this idea based on this other guy's work, and I shot this little Polaroid picture on the animation stand. I put a Polaroid camera on this vertical moving animation stand, put some artwork on there with lights behind, and I opened the shutter on the camera and just started slowly moving the camera toward the artwork with the shutter open, while I rapidly cranked the pan bars on the animation stand, and I got this really weird accumulated three-dimensional exposure. Just an idea, but I thought, well, this is really weird. And I took that I just walked out of that room, I took that Polaroid down to Stanley Kubrick's office, and I threw it on his desk, and I said, this is how I think we can make the Stargate sequence. And he said, absolutely right, go for it. Build whatever you need to build. And so I went to the engineering department, got some tracks and some lead screws and big pieces of glass, and started making artwork, and we cobbled together this really clunky, junky piece of equipment that was about as complicated as a washing machine, and started cranking out these images. And it was just breathtaking to me to find out that, you know, you don't need to own a Panavision camera to make a good image. You don't need to pay a lot of money to make a good image. You just have to get in there and start doing it. You can do it with a Nikon. You can do it with 8mm. You know, you shouldn't let anything stop you from using your imagination and putting an image on film and showing it to somebody. And anybody can do that. Yes?
Oh, I have a question. Inside me since I was 9 years old. And that's on the approach sequence to the space station, the instrumentation, shuttlecraft. It's not in sync.
This is in 2001? Yeah. Well, what looks to be instrumentation in 2001 is 16mm movies. That was my first job on the movies, to make all these fake readouts, which I did by Xeroxing pages out of Scientific American and blowing them up and putting colored gels and turning them inside out and throwing them under the animation stand. And for the most part, those projectors were built into the sets, rear projecting 16mm movies, and they're just running continuously while Kubrick is shooting his shots. There was very little or no synchronization. There was attempts at certain moments to cut into something that seemed to synchronize, but like on the centrifuge set, you know, old Hal is here on the centrifuge set. He's got his little eye in the wall, and there's these 16 movie screens around Hal. Well, that's 16mm movie projectors that have to go upside down. And I'll tell you, it's really fun when all the reels fall off the spindles, you know. But, you know, it was crude. We had no CRTs. We had no real computers. We had no, you know, it was fake. Yes? Shit.
Get your address, baby.
Okay, cool. Well, we're always looking for new talent, and we're right between projects right now, but if you call Howard or somebody, he can track down my phone number. You're welcome. One more, in the back here.
Could you speak of what any transcendent or visionary experiences you had, non-cinematic visionary experiences that you had that preceded 2001?
Ah. Boy, you know, I don't know. I mean, I've never done drugs. I saw, in the early 60s, prior to 2001, I saw my friends doing drugs, and I watched this phenomenon. It was particularly with acid. And these guys would do some acid, and they'd have some, either a really great trip or a really bad trip or whatever, and then they'd come back, and then, you know, they'd be looking at some innocuous thing on the floor, and they'd say, oh, wow! And I said, you know, I don't want my sensibilities disturbed this way, you know, so I'm going to try to be clean and try to, you know, you got to be an artist. I mean, I studied art and the great masters and fine paintings and looked at a lot of films, and, you know, you have to bring to it a certain aesthetic sensibility. But I don't really, I wouldn't say before 2001 I ever had any major life-changing epiphany-type psychedelic experiences of any kind. Never did. I hope we're not going to get run out of here. Anyway, I think we ought to go on and run the movie and get on with the show. So thank you all very much. See you soon.